Hello, my name is Brian Kellerman. I'm the Chief Quality and Food Safety Officer at Kellerman Consulting, and this is our webinar on chemical usage and controls. This is going to be specific to food facilities, but we'll certainly touch on some issues that probably are applicable to some non-food facilities if you're watching this and that's of interest to you. Chemicals are obviously something that almost every facility deals with in one way or another. One of the things I always point out for our webinars, we have a chat function on the right side of my screen. I believe it's probably the right side of yours as well. During this webinar, if you have questions about chemicals or chemical handling as you folks experience it in your facilities, if you type into the chat, I will be able to respond during the webinar. It's one of my favorite things about doing webinars. Hello, Prodip. So for you folks, if you have questions, chemicals are something that are a very challenge. They're a challenge for most facilities, unless you're lucky enough to work in a facility where there really aren't chemicals that are being kept around. We do see that a little bit with like storage and distribution facilities. Sometimes they just don't have a need for chemicals, or they'll have a maintenance shop separate of the facility itself, and do not, they don't have a lot of the concerns around managing chemicals. For those of us who work in facilities that have regular chemical usage, which is, again, the vast majority of facilities, we have the topics that we're going to look at today. Starting with the next slide will be on the areas of greatest concerns about chemicals. We want to jump into what we all experience when it comes to the fact that chemicals tend to show up unexpectedly. People bring them in. People don't think much about them. They are sometimes in the form of personal care items, pest sprays, lubricants, things like that show up in a facility. We're going to talk a lot about maintenance, our maintenance folks. If we have any on this program, then I'm sure they may have some pointers or questions. But obviously, if you go into a maintenance shop, sometimes we just don't know what kind of chemicals we're going to see. In addition to those areas of greatest concern, we're going to focus on risk assessments. If you've seen any webinars that we've put on in the past, you know that I'm very much a risk assessment forward person. I believe that is the solution to a lot of our issues here. Chemicals, certainly that can be the case. We're going to talk about storage, which is a huge issue when it comes to chemicals. How do I store them? What is acceptable? What is not? We'll look at some scenarios there. We're going to talk about both low risk chemical scenarios. That would be where we don't have a lot of chemicals, or we have really tight storage situations. And then when we have complex chemical scenarios, and that's where multiple departments manage this themselves. QA, when they put on their hairnet and smock to go out into the back and look around, they are sweating every single time because they just don't know what chemicals they're going to find. We're not sure if there's a audit or an inspection, if there's going to be some unpleasant discoveries made in hidden places. Those are the complex chemical scenarios. We'll cover both of those. And I will make sure to address both food defense and food fraud as it pertains to chemicals, because they do fit into both of those. Much more food defense than fraud, but it's certainly something we'll touch on as we go through. All right, so let's start in with these areas of our greatest concern. So when we are dealing with chemicals in a facility, and again, to take a step back, we have complex machinery in facilities. Those almost always require some kinds of chemicals, oils, lubricants, degreasers, things like that. So we're going to find chemicals because of the need for maintenance. And that's, again, that is right there, something that just about every facility deals with. In addition, anybody that has any cleaning or sanitation chemicals, now I have another class of chemicals in there. If we manage pest control activities for ourselves, or if there is a need to store pest control chemicals in the facility, those can be present. We have hygiene, so soaps, sanitizers in restrooms, those are chemicals, paints, all kinds of stuff. what we see in cold climates where there's ice or snow, we see salt and things that are kept in the facility. That's often a real challenge because folks bring in de-icing chemicals. They are right next to a dock door. And, depending on how tight we want to be about controlling chemicals, those can be just chemicals lying around. When we look at the areas of greatest concern, one of them is a lack of clear responsibility for who's responsible for chemicals, right? So if we have multiple departments that may run out to the hardware store to purchase chemicals as part of simple repairs or maintaining or stocking stations within the facility, we can have lots of different people going out, acquiring chemicals and bringing them back. That is a potential problem for multiple reasons. One is that the people who are responsible for keeping track of chemicals may not be aware of when they're showing up into the facility. And two, when there are attempts to control chemicals, the people who purchase their own chemicals are very likely to be quite resistant to being told how that has to happen or to lose that responsibility. So believe it or not, there's quite a bit of politics involved with chemicals and bringing them in and all kinds of stuff like that. So where facilities do not have policies and procedures specific to chemicals, you end up with oftentimes a lot of confusion as to who is ultimately responsible for it and who gets to set rules. And again, to go with that, how many chemicals do we have on site? For those of you who are listening to me, if you are in a food facility, do you even know where all the chemicals are and what they are? It's usually a pretty long list, and it gets very murky. If we have a QA lab and a QA person is responsible for chemicals, they're probably aware of what the reagents and what kinds of chemicals are in the lab. But if we're talking about the maintenance area, there may be a lot of confusion as to what's out there. So that can often be a big area of concern. We don't know where those chemicals are. Not only do we not know what they are, but we may not know where they are. Now the storage, and we're going to talk a lot about the specifics of storage. If we don't have good storage practices, so there's the easy and obvious ways to store things, which we would prefer if they're just in a locked cabinet throughout the facility. That's the best case scenario. But I would say as often as not, when I am touring facilities or helping folks in facilities, chemicals are in a bunch of different places, sometimes locked, sometimes not. And that itself causes a lot of questions and concerns, like how do we manage these if, depending on where I go in the facility, it looks one way, and if I go to a different part of the facility, it looks different. It's very challenging for employees or contractors or anyone to really know what the rules are. And then to go along with that, the access. So who's allowed to go get chemicals and when? That's something that, again, in different parts of the facility, we may have different rules. We may have different supervisors who think about it differently. And so that can be quite inconsistent as to how that's managed. And then lastly, labeling of chemicals. We'll talk a lot about that as well to go along with storage. If I purchase something that needs to be diluted, or if I have chemicals, I see it a lot with things like Windex. So we have window cleaners in the maybe in and around QA areas, and those window cleaners may be used by administrators and put in QA labs. People have them in one bottle, they pour them into a different one. That second bottle does not have a label on it, and now we have a problem where we have unlabeled chemicals in the facility. An unlabeled chemical, and we'll talk about this a little more as we start to look into the maps and risk assessments and things. But for me, as a stickler on this matter, I do not care how confident anyone is when they're showing me a chemical in an unlabeled bottle. If I am running a facility and I see a chemical in an unlabeled bottle, I'm throwing it away. Because even if it's light blue, and even if someone says, oh, I'm sure that's Windex, the problem is that the person who pours something into a bottle probably knows approximately when they did it and what that starting chemical was. However, the people who may go to use it after do not know what it is. And this is something where people who are quite cynical about chemicals will say, oh, give me a break. I know what that is. You use your common sense. In a food factory, that's just not the right. It is not the case. Where someone has taken chemicals from one bottle and put it into a unlabeled bottle. Now, it can be as simple as writing down what is on there on that label. You can put a little tag on it, whatever you need to do to identify. It doesn't need to be reproducing the entire label necessarily. That is not always required, or really not, unless it's a hazardous chemical. But the idea of, hey, I know what's in there. I can just use common sense and figure it out. It's really a terrible practice in food facilities. And it's one that, again, for me, if I'm running a QA department or if I have responsibilities as leadership, it's just not going to happen. We're throwing those bottles away and telling people, put the label on it or write something down when you pour it in. Okay, so let's talk about what a chemical risk assessment would look like. I do want to say here, we are gonna be moving, usually when we do the webinars, we talk about sort of the higher level programs, GFSI, GMP certification, and then the regulatory responsibilities, and we kind of separate them out. When it comes to chemicals, there really isn't that much of a distinction because the rules, even at the highest levels of these programs, are pretty close to what the regulatory requirements are. And one of the things that does make it quite confusing is that obviously chemicals are overseen by not just FDA or USDA or your state departments of ag or the health department. They are also overseen by OSHA and the EPA. And most food facilities will tell you that they've never seen the OSHA come into a facility unless an employee made a complaint. Certainly the EPA does not generally come on site to facilities, but we still have our obligations to them. And things like safety data sheets and things like how we handle and dispose of chemicals are not really a food safety issue. They're a regulatory issue for these other types, worker safety or environmental protection. And so the rules are there, but they're not exactly around food defense or food safety rather. And so it gets quite confusing, but at the end of the day, when we talk about the most basic levels of chemical control and the most sophisticated facilities, the rules themselves are pretty uniform. When it comes to risk assessments, this is one place where a regulator is probably not going to ask for a risk assessment on chemicals. A BRCGS, SQF, FSSC auditor may ask someday, like, do you guys have a risk assessment for chemicals? That would be primarily for complex situations. But generally, they're not as required. We've talked about allergens in the past, cleaning and sanitation. Those have requirements in the fancier programs for risk assessments. Chemicals, I always believe in them. They're written statements that are of value to us, but you may not get asked specifically for a chemical risk assessment. With that said, here is an example of it. We have our traditional Punnett square here, or risk matrix square. So we have our greens for low risk, yellow in the middle for our medium risk, and then red for high risk. Red here would be pest control chemicals on site, highly hazardous materials. I will tell you that for like cold storage facilities, they have like freon gas or very flammable gases that are part of the freezing mechanism in those cold storage facilities. That's higher risk. I mean, a lot of times those stations are outside of the facility, but there's a lot of chemicals there. And if anything happens, it can get very dangerous very quick. So when we're thinking about it, green's going to be, hey, I have a couple cleaner and sanitizers for the bathroom, not much else. Medium is where most of us live. I have chemicals. It would be bad if they showed up into the production area. They could definitely contaminate my food, but we have controls of them. Red would be, I am very scared of the chemicals in my facility, but we have very tight controls over them. The frequency in which we assess, generally for chemicals, and this is true both for regulatory and all the way up through like GFSI schemes, usually we are expected to do monthly checks of our chemicals, monthly walkthroughs. Obviously, in facilities that are not tightly run on these matters, it can be never. People just have, the chemicals are just in the facility and it's a free-for-all. Generally, I would expect to see a safety committee or a quality assurance team or the QA manager going around and doing a walkthrough. Now, for those of you who have listened to my webinars in the past, I think we should be doing that every single day, if it's feasible in a facility. we have less than a 50,000 square foot facility, there's no reason not to be walking around every day. Chemicals might be something that are front of mind at least every month. Certainly, if I'm doing my walkthroughs and I see chemicals popping up, if I see, like spray paint and it's just lying on top of a pallet, that's going to jump right out at me, and I'm doing a chemical assessment. At a minimum, we should be doing it once a month. I have an example of a chemical checklist for what that walkthrough would look like. We'll see that in this webinar. But I would think that if you are doing it every month, you should be getting really good responses from customers, from regulators, from auditors. The risks are pretty obvious here, although sometimes they can be different. We're primarily worried, obviously, about chemical contamination. Now, chemical contamination can occur on tools, on utensils. It can occur on equipment that then gets carried into facility, into the GMP areas or the exposed food areas. Certainly, if folks are bringing chemicals, again, when we talk about maintenance, if folks are bringing in toolkits on carts into the areas where there's exposed food and there are chemicals on those carts, we could very easily see scenarios where you have contamination. And as any of you who have been through a chemical exposure event in a facility, they are extremely difficult to clean. So one of the nightmare scenarios that I have seen in projects is a coolant system that was in a food manufacturing facility. The cooling system began to leak. Unexpectedly overnight, it flooded the flooring for several production rooms. And 6 months later, they were still unclear as to whether they had cleaned it properly. They had done cleaning over and over again. There were some tests being done, and there was residue that showed up, months later. Those are really, really bad situations. Obviously, for those of us where we have small amounts of chemicals in small containers, that's thankfully not a common occurrence, but can happen. So we are worried about contamination. The severity I've set here would be, and for most food facilities, if you have chemicals, if you have multiple departments that have chemicals, so if there is cleaning and sanitation done and you have a maintenance department, if there's a QA lab, any of those three, if you just have chemicals in the facility, you should be a medium. Low, again, would be storage facilities. They clean the bathrooms. The chemicals never really go into the warehouse section, and that would, so really even almost ambient storage and storage and distribution facilities could be low. The likelihood for or the probability for contamination, that's usually also going to be a medium if I have chemicals on site. And then what are the controls that we have? We're going to talk about some of these. We have sanitation standard operating procedures. We have dilution logs where we dilute chemicals, and we'll talk about those as part of complex scenarios. We have our food defense checks. We have our food fraud assessments that may be done, and we can include chemicals on those. And then we have our walkthrough inspections. I'm almost certain that most of the folks here who work in facilities have SDS binders or SDS registries. Safety data sheets, those are also controls. We'll talk about how those are used as controls. They have very limited value, but they are valuable and they have to be present. So I wrote an example outcome, but what I want you folks to be thinking about when you're thinking through, like, what's the chemical situation in my life, in my facility? If we have cabinetry without locks on them, or if you're accustomed to seeing chemicals unlocked, that needs to go into your outcome. We know we have unlocked chemicals sometimes. If you have employees, contractors, temp workers, anybody coming into the facility regularly that doesn't work there all the time, that is also something that you should note in an outcome, or in your risk assessment conclusions, because that increases the likelihood of someone misusing chemicals. If you've never had a chemical problem, if you've never had a contamination event, you can certainly put that here and say, hey, listen, our controls have demonstrated to us that we are in control. If you do have a written risk assessment, one of the beautiful things about them is you go back, they are a reference point in time. So if you ever have an event in which there's a a sign that you have problems with controlling chemicals, or you have an event that leads you to believe that actually we need better controls, you can go back to this document, redate it from that time period, and say these are the things we're adding to make this work better for us. So that's approximately what we're thinking about with chemical controls, or excuse me, chemical risk assessments. I do want to add, we have a couple of other areas. This is where we get into the GFSI, BRCGS, SQF, FSSC 22000. We do have some required risk assessments here. So something to think about that include chemicals, compressed air. So if I have tanks of oxygen, if I have nitrogen tanks, so those folks who make anything that get chemical flushes, each one of those cylinders is a chemical. Thankfully, the cylinders themselves are often very well labeled. They're usually locked or sealed up before they're used. But if we have those are extra chemicals. I can tell you on a recent walkthrough of a facility, we found oxygen canisters in the basement of a facility. We were doing an actual evaluation to see if there was potential for explosion in the facility. There was captive dust was the potential source of explosion. We got to the basement and there were canisters of oxygen, and it was like, man, we're looking at potential explosions. These things are definitely, if there's a fire, these things are very likely to explode. They had been there for an unknown length of time, and they had been used previously for other purposes. And so the person showing us around was like, I don't even remember when these were brought in here or what they're for. That is, again, one of the main purposes of these GMP walkthroughs for chemicals. And that would raise, for me, my risk assessment would be increasing the level of risk from medium to high if there's old chemicals that we don't really even know where they're from. But compressed air, I do want to say one last thing about compressed air. They are used for multiple purposes. Compressed air sometimes are food contact. So I actually am spraying air or other chemicals onto surfaces or directly onto ingredients. And then we have compressed air that are used for pneumatic devices, where they are lifting arms and moving parts of a machine, but they're in tubes and they do not touch product. Those pneumatic compressed air risk assessments are very low risk. If the compressed air doesn't touch product, that is a lower risk for those chemicals, and that is treated as differently and not nearly as much of an issue as if I have compressed air and I need to send it out for testing as part of a GFSI program. We have pest control chemicals. Now, this is really important. I've not done a full webinar, I don't think, on pest control. We're not going to have a lot of time for that now. But what I will say is most companies hire pest control operators, so pest control companies, to come in and manage pest control. This is one of the main benefits of it, right? They manage the chemicals. We don't even have them in the facility. Wouldn't even have thought of it because my pest control company brings in chemicals if I'm unfortunate enough to have to need some kind of chemical application of fogging or a spray, or when they spray around the perimeter of the building. We don't manage that, then fine. Your pest control risk assessment as part of a GFSI program would simply say, we have a pest control operator that comes monthly and they manage those things. However, there's a pretty good number of food facilities that want to manage their own pest control. So certainly greenhouses, agricultural businesses, they'll generally have someone with a license and keep those chemicals. Pest control chemicals, any sprays, have to be treated as the highest risk, and they are actually separated from all other chemicals. So you should have a pest control chemical storage area that is completely unique to that, and those sprays stay entirely separate from cleaning and sanitation chemicals and any other hygiene or maintenance chemicals. So we treat them as very high risk. If you have pest control chemicals, immediately you're up into that high risk area. You also have, for food defense, a pretty high risk. If you're managing hazardous chemicals, when you're thinking about your food defense plan, the presence of pest control chemicals or other highly toxic chemicals would make it a very high risk, because someone with ill intention could grab those chemicals and dump them into a bulk container. Now, granted, usually they're pretty strong smelling, but nevertheless, things like bait blocks, those things used for nefarious purposes could do tremendous damage. The next risk assessment we have here are allergens. I do want to point out allergens are a chemical, right? So we classify them in our hazard analyses as chemicals. Anaphylaxis is a chemical reaction, and so it is not a biological or physical issue with food. It is chemical. So when we think about chemicals, and in fact, in many facilities, if you're looking at someone's hazard analysis as part of a food safety plan, when you get to the hazard analysis, almost exclusively the chemical hazards are either generalized, yes, any chemicals, or allergens in exposed food, if allergens are present. And that can be a big problem here, because if we think of chemicals as allergens, yes, that is absolutely correct scientifically, but it's a huge distraction from all the other chemicals we may need to be thinking about. If I talk to a QA team and we have a discussion on chemicals and they're like, well, if you look at our hazard analysis, we've got allergens and that's where we're settled on, and I go out and I see uncontrolled chemicals, it is assigned to me that we've essentially reduced our obligation because we're treating allergens as the only chemical issue. So that's something to consider. We do have to have allergen risk assessments as part of BRCGS and SQF and FSSC programs, and those certainly are risk assessments that address chemicals. Cleaning and sanitation, again, are risk assessments for those. How often we clean, whatever. The chemicals we use are part of those risk assessments. And then, much like pest control chemicals, hazardous chemicals are things that are generally not held on site. We certainly would prefer that there are no hazardous chemicals. However, somewhat frequently, hazardous chemicals are part of operations, can be certainly very strong acids. So with cleaning and sanitation, if we have PAA, if we have peracetic acid and it's undiluted, those barrels are very dangerous until we dilute them out. And there are other acids and bases that oftentimes may be used as part of non-toxic processes, but when we receive them in an undiluted container, if that were to spill, you can have massive damage, and it certainly can be very, very dangerous for the employees if those spill. Okay. Good. So that's some of the background here on the issues and the risk assessments as we're thinking about it. So let's talk about these practices. My hope for folks that have come to this webinar, that this is something you've been thinking about. My hope is that we can talk through what is allowable and what is not good. And hopefully that will give you something to think about and maybe take back to your teams. So what I have here are basically from the bottom to the top of the types of controls that are available. The very best are the pretty obvious ones, which are the locked fireproof cabinets. Those are very expensive. Folks that have, new build out facilities where there was lots of capital to spend building them out often will just see chemical boxes basically around the facility and they're locked. That's great. Let me say, it is great in that any outsider who comes to the facility is going to look at the presence of those types of storage areas, and they're going to basically say, hey, I see what I need to see. And as long as there aren't chemicals lying around outside of them, usually it's a really great practice. The problem with these boxes, of course, are one, the employees who do not get ready access to them are very frustrated, especially if they need to get chemicals out of it regularly. And this is a big part of those risk assessments. If I have lock boxes, but I'm constantly needing to get someone to open it up to get to those chemicals, it can be an extraordinary waste of time in a production day of people standing around or trying to run around finding people with keys to get these things open. I think hopefully some of you have had that experience, know what I'm talking about, that like you have workers on the line who want to clean up in a line changeover or unexpected spill, and now we're waiting for the person who was on break who has a key to get into a lockbox, and all of a sudden something that might have only taken 5 minutes to address stretches into an hour and a half of downtime, and that can be very frustrating. One other control where there needs to be constant acquiring of chemicals and we want to have some control, vending machines. Now, obviously, I don't know, for those of you who have been in industrial facilities that have vending machines, I love them. They're wonderful because you get an actual record of people acquiring things. Usually they're like for first aid, they might be for tools, but for small things of tubes of lubricant or something like that that workers need on the line, acquiring them from a vending machine can be very useful. Again, it can be impractical as far as how big of a container are we talking about? How long are they going to be using the chemical for? Do I need to like stock the vending machine back up every day? So it's a challenge. But if you can do lock boxes or vending machines, those are great ways to have good controls over chemicals. Cages. So obviously, folks have chain link in really tightly controlled operations. We have cages where there are folks checking things out, tools and chemicals. That is really great. It's pretty rare just because you have to staff it and it takes up a lot of space. Love to see those. Separate of that and down below is what I usually see in facilities, which are closets or labeled shelves. And that is especially the case in maintenance areas. If I go into a maintenance room, there might just be curtains between the maintenance area and everything else. So it's not a locked area. And when you go in, there's just cabinets and shelves that are exposed and there are chemicals on there. That is potentially okay. That is, again, when we think about why do we need a risk assessment or what's the value of a risk assessment, if we are doing that, if you are listening to me and you think, gosh, actually, now that I think about it, I've got cabinets and I guess anyone could walk up and grab those chemicals, a risk assessment or a risk statement acknowledging that, but saying, hey, we have monitored this over an extended period of time and people are not taking those chemicals. It isn't nothing. It's not the best. Again, I prefer locked cabinets of chemicals, but if you have at least a statement that says, yes, I acknowledge these are not locked up, but we do train our employees and access is restricted. The people who are allowed to use chemicals know it, and they are using the chemicals at appropriate times. Those people who are not supposed to be using chemicals are trained and don't use them, and we're sticking to it. That's something you can present as a written record that you're thinking about it. And then none, which I do see somewhat regularly, that is the worst, right? If I'm walking around with someone to do an internal audit or a gap assessment or we're implementing a program and I come on site, I can tell you right now, I'm going to open up every cabinet I can find in every drawer. And the amount of times I find I can find all types and manners of chemicals just lying around. And of course, the worst case scenario, and it happens somewhat regularly, is pest control sprays. Someone goes to the store and buys wasp spray because they had a wasp in the facility. They throw it in a drawer. And now all of a sudden it's an uncontrolled pest chemical in and around exposed food. Those are the types of things that, auditors walk out of audits for that. You get 483s for things like that. So having none is certainly the worst option. And if in listening to this webinar, you're realizing, I just don't know if we have any, I would make this a priority, like tomorrow or next week. Start thinking about how we're going to get order into this. So to go along with those controls, the verification actions of security checks. So again, this is where food defense and chemical controls are linked up. When I do a security check, if I think of the chemicals as a potential security risk, and I can do my chemical walkthroughs once a month for hygiene purposes and for general program control. But when I do my food defense, if I just check that chemicals are where they're supposed to be, and I write it down as such, I'm also checking chemicals through that manner, and it addresses both my food defense and chemical control needs. We have allergen test kits for allergens, if where those are treated as, or where we need to be dealing with allergens as chemicals, and then our labeling checks. And again, for me, walking around looking at bottles to make sure that if I have a bottle where a chemical has been poured into a secondary container, that it carries some message of what it is, ideally the date as well when it was poured in. So here I want to spend some time. I have a site map to sort of express a somewhat complicated chemical situation in a example food lab or a food facility. I also want to talk about food fraud and food defense here. So in this map, we have the yellow lines that express controlled access points. My joke here, I guess, if you want to call it that, I thought it was kind of funny. I have listed where the chemicals are used in a facility. When we get to maintenance, it's a big question mark because in my experience, that's oftentimes when we go into the maintenance area, if the maintenance person runs their own shop and doesn't like bristles on oversight, then what chemicals are in there can be a big question mark. And what are they used for? Also can be a big question mark. So as we go through, one of the big points of this site map example is how many different places have different chemicals. I've also indicated where dilution does happen and does not happen. And this would be a complex situation for chemicals. Starting at the top of this picture in the dock areas, in warehousing, there frequently is just no chemicals used. If we had forklifts in a warehouse, sometimes we might have forklift degreaser or forklift lubrication or battery acid or motor oil. Those things might be kept in a warehouse. One area that can be quite confusing is the types of forklifts that folks use. Most modern or contemporary food facilities have electric forklifts with charging stations. However, it's still reasonably common to have forklifts with propane on the back. So we have the propane canisters. That certainly is an elevated risk for chemical hazards. The propane gas is a chemical, certainly in the canister, they're condensed, but those are treated as chemicals. Depending on how an auditor wants to address it, they can get quite strict in food facilities with exposed food. If there are propane tanks on the back of the forklift, that's something that probably should also have a risk assessment. We've been doing that as part of our projects where we have propane on forklifts. We just do a risk assessment for it. It may not be a big deal or a big hazard, but having a written statement to that effect is a really good idea. Going down into the areas of the facility, I put the forklift storage sort of in, assuming here that it really was the forklift would be used in the sort of operational staging areas, bringing stuff from the warehouse, but ultimately storing it down inside, closer to the rooms. So there I put a charging station for electric forklifts, but the chemicals used can be degreasers, compressed air, oil. Those things would be low risk if there's no food around there. But when we get into the maintenance area, we probably should treat it as medium to high risk if we know there are chemicals. If our maintenance folks are good team players and they're really accountable, they want us to know what they've got going on in there, it'd be a lower risk. If you have maintenance folks who are more independent minded and they really are not looking for a lot of people coming in there asking what's going on, that would just raise the risk level of chemicals in there. Going into production rooms, depending on the processing area, I put 3 different processing steps in different rooms: a spice prep room, a produce wash, and the packaging. So assuming maybe like a prepared meal or something like that. In a spice prep room, we may not have any chemicals at all. If we do dry cleaning, there may be forced air to blow things off, but that wouldn't be a chemical issue. And so we can say like, hey, there's no chemicals in this room, but in the produce wash, if we have peracetic acid, it's usually diluted, and I have a dilution chart. In the pack room, if I'm using nitrogen flush, then I may have compressed air, that is food contact. The cleaners and sanitizers in both the produce wash and the packaging room are also chemicals that need to be accounted for. I have a QA lab, so there are going to be chemicals in that QA lab as well. And the big takeaway for this is that you have chemicals in these various different places, and we need to be thinking about whether different departments are actually responsible for that, because the chemicals in the QA lab are almost definitely going to be controlled by the QA department and the lab techs, whereas the chemicals used in production are oftentimes QA is pretty ignorant of those chemicals on a moment-to-moment basis. And maintenance, again, could be a big question mark. And so as we think through putting a risk assessment in place or just trying to get our arms wrapped around how risky the chemicals are, thinking through what chemicals are used in each room, where are those stored, do we feel confident about the storage of those? Those are critical parts of it. So we're going to move towards wrapping up the discussion for the remainder of it, thinking through where do we keep track of the chemicals. We have storage areas fine, but we should have documentation that is quite clear. That is, again, a food fraud and food defense issue. So as we looked at those access points, let me go back and just quickly say, when I do a walkthrough of my facility, and again, if I'm doing daily walkthroughs, if I have an understanding of where the chemicals should be, and I do my walkthrough and I'm finding chemicals I do not expect in places where they shouldn't be, that has a food defense ramification, because if people are moving around chemicals and they can be in places where I don't think they should be, that raises the lack of control issue. And then fraud gets a little bit tricky because generally chemicals, certainly cleaning chemicals, are not what we think of with food fraud. However, folks can use chemicals if you have uncontrolled employees. Sometimes chemicals can be brought in and used as filler, and that would be fraudulent practices in a facility where a chemical might be used, probably not a hazardous chemical, but certainly chemicals could be used for unintended purposes to fill out weight of product. And then more importantly with fraud, where we have purchased chemicals in a facility, and I'm not sure how often folks have seen this, but people can steal those chemicals, right? So if I see cleaner in a facility and I would like some of that for my house, and I have employees that are taking it and bringing it home with them, that type of fraud, theft, may also link up with the fraud of theft of food items in the facility as well. So chemicals are not necessarily directly related to food fraud all the time, but because of diversion and theft as classes of fraud, it is certainly something that you can look for chemicals. And again, this is for both defense and fraud purposes. I know where my chemicals are. I am seeing them put back where they're supposed to go, and my lists of them are correct. Those are ways that we can tie the chemical control process into both food fraud and food defense. So with that in mind, what are the places we're supposed to have, or what are the documents? Where in our system are we supposed to be keeping track of this? There should be a list of the chemicals in your facility. And this is something that during projects, we get a lot of groans and eye rolls for facilities that have lots of chemicals. And it's like, man, I have to have all of the chemicals in my facility listed. Well, the answer to that, the simple answer to should I list them all is yes. If that's a large amount of chemicals, we do see facilities that maybe do repainting jobs and things. So there's lots of like paint somewhere in the facility. If you want to segregate those away from the food operations and you want to say, hey, I don't want to count those, as long as they're stored in a way, long-term or otherwise, where we can argue they are not related to operations, then maybe you don't need to put those on a list. But if I'm walking through your GMP areas, your food production areas, if there's chemicals, those need to be written on your registry. So that can be a pretty long list. Hopefully it's not too long. We need to have technical specification sheets. Now, this is again an area with GFSI schemes, SQF and BRCGS, and FSSE, Primus as well. You need to have a tech specification sheet, not just an SDS. And we'll look quickly at what is on a technical specification sheet. Those are things you should be getting from the manufacturer. They are not necessarily things you can easily access online. SDS sheets are almost always easily accessible online because they don't carry the proprietary information of chemicals, but you need to have a technical spec sheet, or should have one, for the chemicals that are in use. For GFSI programs, that's a requirement. Everybody else considered a best practice. The allergens are listed on that technical spec sheet if there are allergens. And just for those of you who are like, where are there allergens and chemicals? Any degreasing soap They carry a lot of times the little soap with grit in it. Those are tree nuts, usually walnuts, shells, peanut shells, whatever. Those have allergens in soap. With any chemicals, you just are supposed to be able to check to see if you have allergens in them. SDS sheets do not tell you that. Technical spec sheets do. After our technical spec sheets, we need to have our sanitation standard operating procedures that list the chemicals that are used in cleaning and sanitation. If we have dilution, whether those are dispensers on the wall, whether they are hand dilutions where I pour things into measuring cups or buckets and then add water, we should have dilution checks or concentration logs where we're writing down where that's done. And folks get kind of upset when they have automated dispensers. Really, the folks who are asking questions about that are going to be frustrated if you just say, oh, my Ecolab rep or whomever, my chemical company rep comes in and they just refill this. That's fine and good, and that's what their job is. And those are usually very the chemical companies that handle cleaning and sanitation chemicals, by and large, the ones that we've dealt with do a great job. The idea that I don't need to check myself or my workers don't need to check, that is not going to fly for almost any outside inspection or audit of your facility. So we should be checking dilution of those chemicals. Then we have our SDS sheets themselves, safety data sheets. We'll talk about those quick as we wrap this presentation up. The safety data sheets, you need to have them for every chemical. Oftentimes food factories have to then produce SDS sheets for their own food. That can be kind of a challenge, or it's frustrating and tedious, but we need to have SDSs for our chemicals. Sometimes you'll see MSDS, material safety data sheets. That's old fashioned. They changed it over to SDS now like a dozen years ago almost. So usually where I see MSDS, that is a sign that it has been a long time since people have collected those. An SDS binder, almost every facility has that, especially if they have chemicals, but you definitely should be checking to make sure those are up to date as often as you need to make sure that the chemicals that are being brought in, that we have those set safety information. The labeling of all bottles, and then where we have participation from maintenance as far as documenting chemicals. That is something that I would hope for every facility. And is really important, critical. So if they have chemicals, they give you a list to work off of. So let's quickly look at this technical spec sheet versus safety data sheet. What they have on them, there are two different things. So if I'm purchasing online for if I'm purchasing chemicals, it may just be where I purchase. So I can go and do a screenshot of the thing I've purchased. That can count as a technical data sheet sometimes if it has good information on it, but otherwise we may want to contact a manufacturer. If we're buying bigger orders of chemicals, they certainly will send you tech sheets if you ask for them. We should be trying to track these down as best we can. They have the chemical trade name, so the actual name of the chemical. Safety data sheets usually may not. Or they have it, but it's hard to find. So a technical data sheet has usually the company that makes it. It's the trade name. It has allergen information on it. It has how to use it and what the use statements are. And it'll have the directions or instructions on the spec sheet or something like it. Safety data sheets do not have all that information. They have different information. Safety data sheets are for calling 911 if in an emergency. So it has what kind of hazard classification. Is this a toxic chemical? What do I do if it's been swallowed? What do I do if it gets in my eye? What do I do if it gets on skin? It'll have active chemical information, but not necessarily usable information of like, what are these chemicals? It has like, this is the thing that might cause harm. And it has, again, emergency instructions. Does not have allergen information on there. Does not have much information. That's why they're so readily available online, is because it is literally something companies are happy to share with everyone. If you have a chemical, this is what you would tell a 911 operator if someone ingested it or got it on them. And I don't know if folks have had in inspections or audits, auditors will ask, like, show me a safety data sheet and I'm going to give you 30 seconds. And it's like the one part of the audit where you are timed, or they'll ask for multiple SDSs and they'll give you a few minutes to do it. It's because they want to mimic an emergency situation. And that is how you think of safety data sheets. They are for emergencies only. That's the information they carry. Technical specifications are the actual practical information for operations. So we're got about 10 minutes left. We're going to look at a couple examples of the actual documentation and what that looks like for chemical control. This is an example of what a chemical registry looks like. So you would put the name of the chemical, what department or who uses it, the manufacturer of that chemical, and where you store it. Checking that SDS, initialing it. My registry could be pages long. It could be just a couple entries, but we should see a chemical registry addressing all of the chemicals. We have sanitation standard operating procedure in webinars and in the training videos we've done about cleaning and sanitation. We address how sanitation standard operating procedures are put together. You should be checking to see if you have them in your facility. If you're unaware of them, they do and should list the chemicals, and I should be comparing my SSOPs to my chemical registry to make sure that the right chemicals are listed in the right places. Again, here as an example, we have our dilution rates. Those are often kept in SSOPs for the cleaning and sanitation chemicals. And if I use PAA, peracetic acid, as part of like a rinse for vegetables, they may also, the dilution rates may be in the SOPs for operations, but we should make sure those chemicals are listed in the correct place. Here I have concentration logs and cleaning logs. They kind of go together. Concentration, again, can be for cleaning purposes or non-cleaning purposes, but where concentrations are used, so where I dilute things, I should be doing my checks. There should be some test strip or some kind of device that I can use to give me a reference of just what the concentration is of a chemical. That should be logged. Again, every time that I dilute should be done. I do want to quickly say that when it comes to chemicals for cleaning purposes, like peracetic acid, once they're diluted, the shelf life is very short. It's like 72 hours. So folks get confused about that. Peracetic acid has little to no shelf life in its undiluted form, but the minute I mix a batch up, then I really need to use it quickly and get rid of it because it will lose its potency, and then I need to continually do new concentrations. So where I'm doing dilutions, there should be a lot of them, a lot of entries. The cleaning logs should tell us what, if I am doing cleaning, I don't necessarily have to write down the chemicals used as part of the cleaning log, but it should match up with the concentration logs. They do kind of go together. It should tell some story to an outsider looking at it, when I diluted and what I used it for. So here is an example of a GMP walkthrough check. A self-inspection form can be used for all kinds of things for the specific chemical questions. Here do I have COAs for incoming goods? That should have some chemical information. Compressed tanks are checked. My preventive maintenance schedule is up to date, and the chemicals used for those preventive maintenances are on my registry. I've got training records for chemical use. Locks are on cabinets. I've got proper storage and labeling. And food grade grease is kept separate of non-food grade. That's a pretty common check. Those things, again, I recommend to do them at least monthly would be a good practice. But one way or the other, having some questions that you can reference and show that you're checking for chemicals is a really good practice, and very helpful for having an outsider coming in and assessing your chemical practices. So we're wrapping up on the hour, and we have gotten to the last slide here. So just as a quick review for usage and some takeaways. So we should be understanding the different departments that are using chemicals. We should be evaluating for ourselves how much control we actually think we have in a facility. So if you feel confident that, hey, all of our chemicals are locked up, I know exactly where they are. Nobody is purchasing chemicals unless it comes through QA or at least some kind of leadership, production supervisors, then we can feel good about it. But if you're thinking about it while I'm talking and it's like, man, I really don't know what chemicals I have in here, that's something that I would make a high priority to get your arms wrapped around. It is a pretty high risk. So as I mentioned before, some folks will treat allergens as like covering their entire chemical control obligations, or at least from a hazard analysis standpoint. We should really try to separate active chemicals like chemical ingredients from allergens as part of our chemical program. It's pretty important to make sure that we're remembering to treat that as a step to be checking in our process. The usage, storage, and controls, controls, I guess, should be reviewed at least annually. And if there are chemical incidences. So again, if we're doing walkthroughs regularly, that's a really great time to be evaluating whether we actually are in control of chemicals, whether we're storing them properly, signs that they're used properly and not being misused. If we add a new class of chemicals, we should be reviewing our program each time we have a new type of chemical, not just purchasing a replacement. And then anytime there's a worker safety issue, there should be a review of the chemical control program. And all of this should be reported to senior management. So that's going to take us to the end of this presentation. Does anyone, if there are any questions or topics that were missed, you can throw them in the chat. Certainly, if you heard anything that you would like follow-up information about, we can be contacted. This is the way to contact Kellerman Consulting. We'd be able to answer those questions. I will tell you with chemical questions, those are usually pretty easy to answer. So if you just needed a quick question about it, just let us know and we'd be able to get right back to you. All right, I'm not seeing any immediate questions in the chat, so I'm going to assume that everyone heard what they needed from this presentation. It was a pleasure. We'll be putting on some more of these pretty soon, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much.